encourage everyone to keep an open mind as I make the presentation. I've been engaged in different ways with wind turbines. You've got a state pier. You've got biotech coming into your harbor. You've got one of the most fabulous programs ever developed for interdiction of addicts with the police chief, a model for the country. So I relate to this community with the highest level of respect, and we're not going to agree on a lot of things. Vito and I certainly have not agreed on a lot on fishing, but certainly Vito and Jackie. Another example, the Northeast Seafood Coalition. Before that existed, there was not a professional dialogue being advanced for the fishing industry. That has all changed now. Never Jack nor Vito get up to the mic. I always listen at a fishery meeting because I always learn something. I don't always agree. But the level of discourse from the Northeast Seafood Coalition has been here is just remarkable. So I want to first give you a little context on this issue. Let's see, blank. So I want to start off at a pretty high altitude, but this isn't the vantage point I want to start out with. I want to start out with this one. If you rotate the globe, this is, and it illustrates pretty graphically the fact that Earth is mostly ocean. 70% of it's ocean, 98% of the water's in the ocean. The oxygen in every other breath we take comes from photosynthesis from the ocean. It's a very important component of the planet. It's the critical component of the planet. And I want to put another spin on the size of the ocean, and that is that it's finite. This is a slide that was done by Woodsville Oceanographic. So if you took all the oceans of the world, all the water in all the oceans of the world, and put them into a sphere, this sphere here represents proportionally how much water there is on the planet in the oceans. Just for your reference, this sphere here is all the rivers and lakes and groundwater, and this sphere, this little sphere over Atlanta, is just the rivers and lakes on the entire planet. But that'll give you an idea that we're really talking about a finite resource, and that was something that we all have come to fairly late, really, and I'll go into that a little bit. So zooming in a little closer, this is our part of the ocean, the Gulf of Maine. It was largely formed by glaciers. The glacial sheet was down as long as 25,000 years ago, stopped more or less along the edge, the line of George's Bank. At that point, so much of the seawater was in the ice that the ocean was actually 300 feet or more lower than it is today. So George's Bank was above water and connected to the mainland. There were mastodons and sloths and giant walruses and tundra, and fishermen actually occasionally bring up these archaeological bones. I think they've recovered 5 walruses from George's Bank. About 11,500 years ago, as the glaciers receded and water came back into the ocean and started to fill back up again, George's Bank became an island. And then about 6,500 years ago, George's Bank went underwater, which it is today. And although it's underwater, it's still a very prominent feature. George's Shoals here is, I don't know, about 15 feet. I mean, you could, there are stories from the colonial days about people getting off and touching the bottom there. But so it's a really contained, interesting sea within the sea. It's not, in any sense, open ocean. We got involved probably we've been doing work throughout the 90s. So we had several conferences with fishermen to look at the impacts of fishing gear on ocean bottom, and we had a number of workshops, produced a bunch of cooperative materials. And then the New England Fishery Management Council got involved with its Omnibus Habitat Amendment. And Vito, I think, will go into some detail about that. But we started to engage in that process. But early on, because of the work we'd done previously, the question we had was, is there anything worth saving in the sense of a natural area? We've been fishing here for hundreds of years. People have prehistory. People have been fishing here, have been dragging here for as long as we've had draggers. So the ocean floor is very different now than it was originally or naturally. And so we pulled together a group of 16 scientists. I think, John, maybe you were there. I'm pretty sure you were there. 16 scientists who had studied the Gulf of Maine and asked them the question, you know, no fancy analysis, back of the envelope, do you all think there's still areas that are worth saving? Of course, every scientist identified their project area, and there wasn't uniformity about that. But there were two areas that there was uniform agreement of all the scientists that these areas are really critical, they're important, and they're still in good enough shape so that they could at least recover to almost natural conditions. And those areas are the areas around Cassius Ledge, right here. And just again, the geology, this is the ledges part here are mostly granite. And that granite is geologically connected to the granite on Acadia National Park. So if you imagine those ridges, it's similar to it. This one ended up underwater rather than above water. But so the Cassius Ledge area, and we'll go into more detail. And then these canyons that you see coming up here, the canyons and the seamounts. The scientists were generally interested in all the canyons. They said they were all very valuable. This will give you a sense. This is a modern plot of fishing activity. This is mostly draggers. This shows all the, an estimate of all. I mean, this is a satellite. This is actual footage of ships that are out there going at a dragging speed. So the assumption was if a boat was moving below 4 knots, it was dragging. But you get a sense that fishing activity is very broadly spread. The reason there are some of these openings, these are fishery closure areas. So that's Jeffries, this is the Cassius Ledge area. Some of the areas are very shallow. These are other closures. But, you know, that fishing activity is extensive. We tried to narrow it down to representative canyons that were farther offshore, that were probably used less. And the proposal that we think is the best proposal includes these 3 canyons, as well as these 2 canyons up right against the Canadian border. This is the Canadian-U.S. border that comes out across Georges Bank, and then it's the 200-mile limit. So you see it swinging down here. These dots are ancient volcanoes that were active about 100 million years ago. They're the northern part of what's called the New England seamount chain, and they start here and they go down to Bermuda. Because they're isolated from each other, they are areas of huge scientific interest because of the endemic biodiversity that tends to be found in these places. They're very deep, and we're talking the volcano's Bear Seamount rises, I think, about 7,000 feet off the seafloor, but they're thousands and thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean. NOAA has mapped all these areas fairly thoroughly. This is sonar mapping, and this will just give you an idea. This is a 3D representation of Bear Seamount on the left and Phasalia on the right, to give you sort of a sense of what they would look like if you could go down. What happened was they brought their international exploratory ship called Okeanos to this area and spent a lot of time there 2 summers ago, I think now, lowering a high-definition camera down to the bottom of the ocean, thousands and thousands of feet, and exploring what's down there. And I mean, you have to remember that this is the first time probably any of these animals ever saw light. I mean, there's no light down there. I have a few slides that illustrate the wealth of biology that's in these areas. These are the canyons and the seamounts. And they don't really know when it's going to stop. They discover new species every time they dive. It's pretty exciting. So I'm just going to go through some of the photographs. These are all high definition, probably 3,000 feet deep. Some of these corals are probably hundreds of years old. They grow very slowly at those depths. They're very vulnerable to being damaged. They're discovering a fair number of new species of corals. This is actually a fish that ends with saurus, so maybe it's close to a very prehistoric kind of fish. It's a bathysaurus. You ever catch one of those? No. That's a Greenland shark cruising along at depths. You also will see swordfish. There's one video that's on the Okeanos internet site where they're looking at a starfish or something, and a swordfish swims right in front of the camera. That's dived from the surface down and is hunting along the bottom. These areas also are major upwellings because of the current coming up. That's what gives George's Bank its biological productivity, of these upwellings that are bringing nutrients up. And there's a whole food web in the waters above these canyons and seamounts. It has turtles, endangered sperm whales, beaked whales. There are killer whales out there. And then, as I said, there are puffins. So, you know, the scientists tell us these are very special areas. And I wanted to just list briefly what some of the threats are. The threats in terms of human activities that are or could impact these resources. I think beyond question, the single most widespread human activity, certainly in New England and certainly for hundreds of years, has been fishing. This isn't probably an exact New England otter trawl. The doors don't look like they do, but this will give you an idea. There's also the foot rope and everything. But this otter trawl is a very predominant way of catching fish. I have no objection to otter trawl being used, but it is a bottom contacting gear. Some of the other gears that are bottom contacting by design, the scallop gear, the squid nets apparently are on the bottom maybe 20% of the time. Herring nets sometimes go down on the bottom even though they're mid-trawler. So a lot of these gears are bottom gears. So fishing is one of the activities that is altering the natural environment. The other one that, again, goes back to 1977 with me in Gloucester is oil and gas drilling. You know, Angela and Lena and Pipers at that point, but you know, and John, you know, we took on the oil industry as a group and protected George's Bank for fish and for fishing and for its marine life. There is still interest. There is gas on George's Bank. There's still interest in drilling on George's Bank. It's not a high priority, but it is an area that they have not taken off the potential list. And more significantly, Canada has just recently issued 2 exploration permits to big companies to put exploratory wells just to in the Canadian waters and east of George's Bank, but not far east, maybe 120 miles, 130, which is not very far east given the currents out there, and that's concerning. But oil and gas is always a threat. The other threat, particularly to the seamounts and to some of the deeper canyon areas, is deep sea mining. That it's cost effective to mine at those depths, but it is. It's being done around the world. It's we know that there are, we don't know, I'm told that there are minerals there, methyl hydrates and other things that would be very valuable to recover. So deep sea mining is another activity that would serve as a threat. close here, I just wanted to draw a contrast. Fantastic natural resources. It's forests and it's oceans. They've defined this region since the beginning of time. On land, we have been, in addition to forestry, in addition to farming, in addition to all the activities we use with land, we have understood the importance of having some areas in conservation for a long time. The first land wilderness area was created by Ulysses Grant in the 1860s. We know that now as Yellowstone. It was created to offset the ravages of the buffalo herds and everything else. In New England, from the Adirondacks to Baxter State Park, they're just for public lands. There are 5,000 square miles of land in permanent wilderness status, or ecological reserves, or preserved in their natural state. And there's probably at least that much in private lands associated with it. The nature, just to give you an idea, the Nature Conservancy recently bought a chunk of forest land around Moosehead Lake. I think it's 580 square miles. Just like that. Went from forest land into wilderness. And so on land, we have known that these conservation areas are important and they work well with forestry. They work well with other things. In the ocean, we've thought about the ocean differently. It's interesting. Back in the 1860s when Grant was protecting Yellowstone, Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, where he said basically the oceans are unlimited, the fish are unlimited, therefore it is silly to want to try to manage fishing. And that really was a very prevalent attitude, and it didn't go out of style in the 1860s. It has persisted pretty consistently that there's this kind of infinite resource that's available. So in contrast to what we're doing on land, this State Park, this is what we're doing in the water. We have no areas that are protected for wilderness, that are protected as ecological reserves, that are protected for conservation purposes, that are protected for marine biodiversity protection. We have nothing. And that is a situation that is changing pretty rapidly. You know, we have the two presidents now essentially create large reserves in the Pacific, about 490,000 square miles of the Pacific. Countries are doing this around the world. People driven by modern science are realizing that it's important to have some areas that are kept in a conservation status. In New England and the Gulf of Maine in particular, and I'm just about done, this is more important than ever. The Gulf of Maine, we're told again by scientists at several places now, that the Gulf of Maine is heating up faster than 99% of the water bodies on the planet. We are completely unprepared for this. That we could use for reference sites. We have no sites that are completely undisturbed where scientists could have long-term studies over the next 10, 20, 30 years and actually document, independent of other impacts like pollution, which happens in the coastal areas, or fishing, or anything else that's sort of interfering with the signal of what's happening from climate change. We have no areas where scientists could actually try to understand how climate change is affecting us, how we need to adjust our management rules to account for that. I think with some fisheries, there'll be increases in fish. Other fisheries, they're at risk. So learning early when some of these signals are starting to show up is very important. So I've talked about protecting these areas for their conservation purposes, for their wilderness value. I've talked about protecting them for climate change, to increase the resilience of the. You know, a lot of people are supporting this idea because they just want to celebrate the ocean. There is a place out there in the Atlantic that they love and that they grew up on and they've spent their lives on, whether it's fishermen or others, that is just being left the way it was naturally enough to be important to everybody. But just knowing that there are wild places out there is something that the public cares a lot about. So I guess that ends my slide. I would like to turn it over to John, who's been diving out in the Gulf of Maine since the early 1980s, just to talk about some of these areas from a scientist's perspective. I don't know if you want to see any of those.
Actually, I'd love to go back to habitat diversity.